She never raised her voice. She never threw a punch. She never said anything you could technically call cruel. And yet somehow, every room she entered rearranged itself around her. People laughed louder, got quieter, shifted their posture, all within seconds of her arriving. If you've ever felt that invisible pressure and couldn't name it, there's a reason. What you were sensing wasn't cruelty. It was a system, a carefully constructed social architecture designed to regulate status, neutralize threats, and sustain dominance, without ever leaving a fingerprint. We tend to explain this kind of behavior with a simple story. Some people are just mean, insecure, jealous, damaged. It's satisfying as an explanation because it places the problem entirely inside the person, something broken in them that has nothing to do with us. But behavioral science tells a different story. What we call mean girl behavior isn't random cruelty. It's a structured social strategy. It has a consistent psychological architecture, identifiable triggers, and a predictable logic. One that most people never see because it's specifically engineered to be invisible. Understanding it isn't about excusing it. It's about seeing it clearly enough to stop being affected by it the way you currently are. To understand the behavior, you have to start with the brain, specifically the way the human brain processes social threat. Naomi Eisenberger's neuroscience research at UCLA established something that should change how you see all of this. Social rejection activates the same neural circuitry as physical pain, the same regions, the same intensity. Your brain doesn't meaningfully distinguish between being hit and being excluded. It treats both as threats to survival. This isn't a metaphor, it's a functional reality, which means that when someone operates in a social hierarchy, especially during adolescence when identity is still forming, the perceived loss of status is processed like a genuine emergency. Now, here's what most people misunderstand. This threat system doesn't make people aggressive, it makes them strategic. When the threat system is chronically activated, it doesn't produce anger outbursts. It produces careful, calculated social behavior designed to neutralize the perceived threat before it lands. And that precision, that calmness, is what makes certain social aggression so difficult to name and so difficult to defend against. Psychologist Nikki Crick coined the term relational aggression in the 1990s to describe a form of harm that operates entirely through relationships, through exclusion, rumor, social withdrawal, silent treatment, and the manipulation of group belonging. Unlike physical aggression, it leaves no visible evidence. It's deniable, precise, and because it works through the social environment rather than against a specific person, the target often can't even articulate what's happening to them. The deeper pattern here is that relational aggression is not impulsive. It's regulated. It's controlled. The person deploying it is managing their own threat response by externalizing it, by converting internal anxiety into social leverage against someone else. Psychologists call this behavioral compensation. The aggression isn't an overflow of emotion. It's a containment strategy for emotion. This is where most people get it wrong. They assume that the person causing harm is experiencing some kind of pleasure or power. Sometimes that's true, but more often, what you're observing is someone in a quiet state of threat activation, managing their nervous system by managing the social landscape around them. The cruelty is the regulation. That's the part that's hard to sit with. Here is a dynamic that goes largely unspoken. The people most likely to become targets of relational aggression are rarely the most obviously different. They're often the most similar. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's research on self-esteem and aggression reveals a counterintuitive finding. Fragile high self-esteem, the kind that's brittle and dependent on external validation, is a stronger predictor of interpersonal aggression than low self-esteem. The person who needs to be seen as confident, smart, socially desirable, and encounters someone who embodies those same traits experiences what researchers call an identity incongruence, a threat not to their body, but to their narrative about themselves. This is why the new girl who is too pretty, too funny, too well-liked, too quickly, becomes a target, not because she did anything wrong, but because her existence disrupts the stability of someone else's identity architecture. She doesn't have to compete, she just has to exist. The deeper reason this matters, it means that being targeted is often a signal of proximity to something valuable in yourself. That's not a comfort intended to minimize real pain. It's a structural fact about how threat perception works at the identity level. Sociologist Rosalind Wiseman's research on adolescent social hierarchies introduced the concept of the queen bee, a dominant social figure who maintains position not through likability, but through the strategic management of loyalty and fear. And what's striking about this architecture is its fragility. The queen bee position requires constant maintenance, constant surveillance of the social environment, constant behavioral signaling to reinforce status. Because it isn't built on genuine security, it's built on the management of insecurity in others. What people don't realize is that high social dominance among adolescent girls is not correlated with lower anxiety. It's often correlated with higher anxiety, higher cortisol regulation demands, and greater sensitivity to perceived slights. The performance of dominance is itself a form of chronic stress, which is why the behavior escalates rather than stabilizes. Each act of social control temporarily regulates internal tension, but because it doesn't resolve the underlying fragility, it has to be repeated. It becomes a loop. This is the queen bee paradox. The most visibly powerful position in a social hierarchy is often occupied by the most psychologically vulnerable person in it. The performance is so convincing that even the performer begins to believe it. And that belief in the stability of a position that can only be maintained through constant effort is its own kind of trap. Perhaps the most underexamined piece of this system is the role of everyone else. Because relational aggression doesn't operate in isolation, it requires an audience. And the audience, the bystanders, the sidelines, the people who watch and stay silent, are not passive observers. They're functional participants in the system. Social psychologist Stanley Milgram's research on conformity and group pressure demonstrated how powerfully the desire for social belonging overrides individual moral judgment. In a social hierarchy under active management, bystanders face a precise psychological bind. Intervening on behalf of the target means risking the redirected attention of the aggressor. Staying silent means becoming complicit. Neither option feels safe. So most people choose the path that minimizes immediate personal threat, and that choice, multiplied across every person in the group, is what sustains the system. This is the architecture no one talks about. The mean girl doesn't just operate on individual victims. She operates on the collective regulation of the group. The silence isn't indifference, it's managed compliance. And because everyone is partially complicit, everyone is also partially motivated not to name what they're seeing. The system maintains itself not through one person's cruelty, but through everyone's quiet agreement to behave as if cruelty is normal. There's a particular kind of relief that comes from seeing a social system clearly, not to excuse it, not to rehabilitate it, but to strip it of its confusion. When behavior that once felt personal and random reveals its internal logic, something shifts. It becomes less about what's wrong with you for feeling affected by it, and more about what's structurally predictable about how this system operates. You weren't imagining it. You were accurately perceiving it. You just didn't have the language for it yet. People who notice patterns like this, who develop the capacity to see beneath surface behavior to the psychological mechanics underneath, tend to move through social environments with a different quality of composure. Not because they no longer feel affected, but because they understand what they're feeling and why. That understanding is its own form of regulation. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, there's more like it here. The patterns people feel but can't name. That's exactly what this channel is for. What other topics do you want us to dive deep into? Let us know in the comments.